All right. Welcome everybody to Tree School Online. I'm Mike Clossy, Director of Forestry with the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. And I'm your moderator and host for today. Thank you for being here. We have a great webinar for you. Tree School Online is a production of the OSU Forestry and Natural Resource Extension Service and also the Partnership for Forestry Education. And we want to give a special shout out to OFRI for leading the project and also to the Oregon Department of Forestry and the U.S. Forest Service for giving us a grant that covers all of our expenses. These webinars are scheduled every Tuesday through July 28th. We've been having two webinars, one at 10 a.m., which would be this one, and then one at 3 p.m. Today marks would have been the 4-month anniversary of Tree School Clackamas, which was March 21st, and it marks the 3-month anniversary of when we started these webinars. So we started on April 21st, and this is webinar 25. So after next week, we're going to take a break for the month of August, but we will be back on September 1st, and we're going to do 2 webinars a month rather than 2 webinars a week. So look, the website here is where everything will be advertised at the Tree School Online. So you'll be able to know what's coming up. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping details. We're using Zoom is our method for the webinars. And if you've been on Zoom before, which many of you have, you know that the key is the Zoom toolbar, which is across the bottom. And this is where you will have access to the Q&A, to polls, to the chat screen, and others. So we're set up as a webinar, so different from a Zoom meeting. We don't have, the participants won't have audio or video access. You'll be able to listen to us and watch us, but not necessarily talk to us directly. And so that's why the Q&A is so important, because that's what we want you to do, is do written questions in the Q&A box. The chat box is what we use to communicate to you. That would say like the webinar has started and where the resources are. But if you have trouble, if Amanda Brenner is manning or staffing our chat box, and so you can check with Amanda and she can help you out. But just, that's really where we give messages to you. We want you to do the Q&A for Casey and Dan to come in through the Q&A box. We have resources that Dan and Casey have provided, and Amanda has them posted on the Tree School Online webpage, which on the graphic here, it's up in the upper left. So you should be able to get some really good guides that they'll be talking about. Also, later today, after the webinar is over, the slides will be posted there also in a PDF format. So you'll be able to have access to those. We are recording the webinar, and it should be available to be seen by next Monday or so. Usually takes us about a week to get them up. The final thing before I introduce Dan and Casey is to let you know that we do polls. During the beginning of the show and at the end of the show, we have polls to find out about you, and then at the end to find out what you thought about how we've done today. So watch for those. It should pop up in your screen when I start the poll, and it should be a pop-up box that then when you answered all the questions, it goes away. However, with some setups, instead of popping up, a light will go on in your toolbar, and you need to click on the polls button, and then the poll will open. So that's enough housekeeping. I think you guys have heard enough from me, and what you want to hear is what Dan and Casey have to say. So I'll ask them to turn on their videos and their audios, and Casey Clapp and Dan Gleason are here. They're both pruning experts, and we're going to teach them about pruning today, right, guys?
That's right.
That's the plan.
So tell us a little bit about what you're going to say, and then we'll go to the first poll.
Well, that sounds good. Hey, thanks everyone for stopping by and watching us today. My name is Casey Clapp, and I work for the City of Portland as a tree inspector. And I'll be focusing mostly today on the pruning, some physiology of trees, as well as specifically the pruning for timber quality. And then Dan will be taking over the other half. Dan?
Yeah, and I also work for the City of Portland as a tree inspector. And I'll be focusing on landscape trees, talking about pruning techniques health and some of the concepts that you should know to be able to take care of some of the trees at your house. You'll probably find Casey and I will jump in and bring up any points for different slides and kind of work together through this presentation.
All right. And they have a special treat for you. And this is taught at tree school. After they're done with the inside part, they go outside and show you some stuff. So at the end, if there's enough time, they have prepared a video that I think will be very helpful. It's really cool. So thanks for being here, guys. Let's go to the opening poll. So popping up on your screen is the poll, and it's just 4 questions, and it's just about you. So the first question is, where are you from? Willamette Valley, Coast, Southwest Oregon, Central or Eastern, Washington State, USA, outside USA. Second one, are you a woodland owner, private natural resource professional, agency natural resource professional, nonprofit natural resource professional, or others? How many acres do you own or manage? From 0 up to over 1,000. And the final one is specifically for this show. Are you more interested in timber pruning or landscape pruning, or kind of equal? And what we tend to get is we get a lot of people from the Willamette Valley. We get a lot of people that are woodland owners, and we get a lot of people that own about 40 acres. And boy, we're hitting right in there. And most of you are interested in both. So far, we've got 86% of you have voted, and I always go at least a minute. So we've been 1 minute into the polling, so I'll stop it, share the results. Sure enough, you're our typical audience. 73% of you are from the Willamette Valley, a couple from other parts. 73% of you are woodland owners, and 25% other, which is, I think maybe these are people that are into the landscape trees. Let's see if that carries over in number of acres, about 40. It's just like a bell-shaped curve, just perfect. And then a little equal. 66% are interested in either or both. 20% for landscape, 20% for timber, and 14% for landscaping. So it sounds like we've got your crowd here, guys.
That sounds just about perfect.
Let's go on with the show. Take it
right.
away, Casey.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much, Mike. And thank you, Amanda, and everybody else at Tree School for getting this all set up. I know with all the adversity everyone's going through, I really want to say thank you to you guys for all what you've done. So this is just a little quick about me. My name's Casey Clapp. I was born and raised here in the Willamette Valley, just outside Portland. And I initially went over to Oregon State University and got a degree in forest management from Oregon State University. 1 second. And then decided that I wanted to continue on. So I ended up pursuing a Master's of Science from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And that was focused on specifically urban forestry and arboriculture. So I kind of transitioned away from more traditional forestry and really focused it on management of trees in and around urban areas and other targets. So through that, I became a certified arborist as well as a qualified tree risk assessor. And now for several years, I've been working either as a consultant or as a tree inspector with the city of Portland, helping to regulate different situations with development and trees in the right of way. And then what about you, Dan?
So again, my name's Dan Gleason, and funny enough, Casey and I almost have reverse history when it comes to our schooling. I'm originally from Massachusetts and got my undergrad at the University of Massachusetts, focusing in communications. I then worked in New York City, training arborists to do climbing and pruning, as well as doing ecological restoration, focusing on reforestation in an urban environment, as well as working for a private tree care company, pruning trees throughout New York City. I decided I wanted to pursue an advanced degree, and also it had always been a goal of mine to come out to Pacific Northwest. And so I was able to get into a master's program at Oregon State University, where I focused on communicating forestry information to woodland owners and to the public to advance communication focused around both urban and traditional forestry. I've also been an ISA certified arborist for about a decade, as well as a qualified tree risk assessor. And I've been with the city of Portland working both the education side and in the municipal permitting side for about 4 years now.
Perfect. So we're just going to jump right in now after that and kind of discuss a little bit about pruning. And we wanted to kind of start with this quote here. So pruning is one of the best things an arborist can do for a tree, but one of the worst things we can do to trees. So this is by Alex Shigo in his Best Management Practices for Tree Pruning. And he's written a couple books and kind of in the more urban side of things in arboriculture. He's known kind of as the father of modern arboriculture, specifically because he was one of the first to actually really delve in and ask questions on what exactly is this tree doing? How is it reacting? Why does it react a certain way? And sort of what physiology is happening to a tree. So he really started dissecting trees and did certain kinds of cuts and then did horrible things to trees and then did great things to trees and compared what it is and came up with a very complex biology of what trees are and how they work. And so when we're talking about pruning, we want to really focus on two things. One, trees have been doing things their own way for many millions of years. So whenever you are thinking like, well, I have to do something that's better for the tree, you really have to start looking at it from two different perspectives. As a timber and a small woodland owner, you're looking at growing this tree as a crop, so you want it to be a very specific way. Whereas if you're growing a tree in a landscape, your objective isn't quite the same. It's not to make the tree the tallest, the fastest, or anything like that. It's to make it, very healthy. But a lot of times you can find people who will over prune their trees or do things that they think are good for the tree, but really what's good for the person is not necessarily good for the tree. So we want to make sure that as we're going through this, we're focusing on why we're pruning, because if you don't focus on the why, on the objective, you can really find yourself causing more long-term damage to a tree. And in the case of timber, you want to make sure to avoid that because that long-term damage could, of course, end up being a long-term loss, or at least not as much of a gain as why you would prune the tree in the first place. So again, to move on to that, why do we prune? So for forest trees, we prune a lot for timber quality, for fire resistance, for access for either walking or trails or machinery to get in there. But we also prune for habitat. Many times you'll see topped trees in natural areas. People are like, why did you do that? And it's because you're trying to create a habitat snag or to create a branch stub or something like that that would be better for habitat. And then if you're in the landscape, and this doesn't have to be an urban tree necessarily, it just really fits nicely into sort of those two categories. But when you're thinking about landscape or urban trees, this is really just a tree in your backyard, a tree in the street, in the park, at a school, things like that. So the objectives are slightly different. You'll be focusing more on trying to prune for the tree's health, for the shape, for the form, aesthetics. You're looking for safety to make sure that you don't have a dangerous branch that is up in a tree that needs to be removed, say, a broken hanger or a twisted branch rubbing, things like that. So we want to really make sure that you're addressing, first of all, your objectives as to why you're pruning. So what do you need to know in order to prune a tree? Well, first, again, you have to focus on your purpose for pruning. Random pruning or just, I think this tree needs to be pruned is not necessarily the right reason. The right reason would be, okay, why do you think this tree needs to be pruned? What's your objective? Second, you need to understand a bit about tree biology and physiology. Now, this is because, as I was discussing with Shigo earlier, tree biology and physiology have great impacts on what the tree is going to look like and how that tree reacts to whatever pruning you're doing. So again, to hit back on the Modern Arboriculture book by Alex Shigo, he really, really dissects the trees to say, here's how we should prune and here's why, because it'll ultimately make your tree either healthier or help reduce negative aspects of that tree. So because we're working with trees, most of you are probably familiar with trees and how slowly they grow. So the timeline of human versus trees. So we don't live near as long as many trees. Trees take a much longer time to do, to respond to different wounds or to take up space or to, mature in whatever way. So if you cut off a branch, then in the next 3 years, it's going to have a certain effect. But then in the next 30 years, it's going to have a different effect with, say, the entire shape of the crown or you'll have different things that happen where another tree could come in and take over that tree. So the one that you pruned ended up getting shaded out. So there's all different, there's a few different small short-term effects and long-term effects that need to be focused on. And finally, you want to focus on the proper pruning techniques. Again, based on the tree biology and physiology, if you end up pruning a tree incorrectly, then that tree is going to respond in a way that you didn't want or didn't expect. And then that can end up causing quite a bit of trouble down the line. So when we're pruning for forest trees, you want to focus on your initial objectives, which would be the amount of pruning that you're going to be doing, your timing, your cost benefit, as well as coordination. And that coordination is really just mostly amongst you and your ability or your management, whatever you're doing over, let's say, a 50-year rotation of your trees. You want to make sure that you're not, say, pruning your trees and then going in and thinning out the trees that you just pruned. That ends up being a waste of money. So you want to really focus on all these little things in that regard. So one of your biggest objectives is going to be pruning for mainly high value timber or to reduce ladder fuels, access, and habitat. Access and habitat are probably the two less known or less, they're not the objective most of the time. The main reason to go in to prune trees is to create a high core log, a high value butt log, which is the log that's right off the stump going up, the first log that's going up off the stump. So what you're looking for is high value timber. And what's important about this is that you're looking to create the tree or allow the tree to start compartmentalizing over all of its wounds and putting on 100% increments of wood where there's no knots, there's no defects or anything like that. That way, one tree or the trees that you take out at the end of your rotation have a much higher value. And if not much higher, at least high enough that it makes the costs of going in worth it. Second, you want to reduce ladder fuels. As right now, we're getting into late July, going into August, where of course we start getting fire dangers, especially as you get further out into the woods, especially on the east side. So because we have suppressed fires in the Pacific Northwest for so long, we have ended up creating forests that are quite dense and quite packed. And everyone I'm sure, is familiar with many of the catastrophic fires we've had in the last 10, 15 years. So everything in our region, except for mostly some things along the coast, are ecosystems that have been involved with fire for millennia, whether that was set by native peoples who are here or lightning strikes or any sort of volcano, there's just about anything. But especially on the east side, down in the southern areas, in the Willamette Valley, these areas have had fires. And so if we don't have fire or have pruning as a part of our management, many times that can actually create ladder fuels, which is basically having grass catch on fire, then catch shrubs, then catch low limbs, then catch dead lower limbs. Then all of a sudden the fires race up into the crown of the tree and cause quite a bit more damage. Whereas if those fires were coming through often, then you'd end up getting a much reduced amount of fuel. So if we don't want to have fires or we can't have fires, then pruning is a really good alternative to help reduce those ladder fuels and raise the actual living canopy of the tree up so that you don't have all those dead branches on the bottom sides of the tree just waiting to catch on fire whenever they get the opportunity. But again, access is very important, especially if you're having a mechanical harvester come through. As that mechanical harvester is driving through, if it doesn't have the ability to go in and around the trees and it has to just crush through a bunch of smaller trees, you're going to cause a significant amount of damage. And Dan will talk about that a little bit later when we discuss different pruning techniques and what injuries can happen if you, say, rip a branch off while pruning or if it gets ripped off from something else. And then, of course, the last bit is habitat, where we're dealing with trying to make sure that if you're managing your woodland, instead of for an ultimate goal of high value lumber, habitat many times is much more important in certain areas. So you'd want to prune trees so that they either have a nice open space underneath them for birds to fly, or prune them so there's more light coming down to the forest floor and the lower canopy to create secondary growth. So there's a lot of different reasons a lot of different methods that pruning can create habitat.
And Casey, if I could jump in real quick,
Of course.
through the years, we've been learning more about people's interest in doing multi-use forests. So having some of their forests be for timber production, but then also have portions that might be available for forest-wide permaculture or harvesting different kinds of undergrowth, fruits and berries. So using habitat to think about areas for pollinators or light availability that's hitting the forest floor that you can control through pruning are also objectives that you might want to think about as you're plotting out what you want to use your whole forest land for.
Yeah, that's correct. Thanks, Dan. So as we move on to more specifics, let's focus on the objective of high value timber. So what's important about high value, or why, what makes pruning, what makes a piece of lumber higher value or lower value really depends on the amount of knots that are in it. That's a big factor. So there's two main kind of knot. There's the ingrown knots, which are the tight knots that as a tree grows, it is actively, connecting or actually overcoming whatever branch is there. And so those knots are created when a branch is alive. And so many of you have seen these knots in wood. A lot of it's used in veneer lumber, for instance, where you get these really nice big knots. But those knots, if you push on them, they don't move, they don't go anywhere. They are as sturdy as a part of that wood as any other piece of that wood. And that is in contrast to encased knots, or the loose knots. Now, these are all knots that are made after the branch has died. And we'll get into this a little bit more when we discuss a little bit about physiology of trees. But in a quick, or to sort of cover that quickly, an ingrown knot is produced when a tree is still alive because the actual branch is growing outwards and the stem itself is growing outwards from the pith of that stem. So this photo on the left here, it shows the pith in the middle and it shows these tight or ingrown knots. Now those are grown because every single year when a new branch, or when the springtime comes, new wood is put on a side branch and new wood is put on the actual stem of the tree. And each year those push up against each other and they create a really strong connection for that branch. As soon as you cut that branch or that branch dies, the stem of the tree is still going to be putting on 1 year's worth of growth every single spring, but that branch is no longer going to be pushing outwards. So at that point, the tree just slowly covers in over the top of that cut or that broken limb. When that happens, you end up getting wood that's really tight on the outside, but as the bark that's covering that initial cut branch, when that starts to die, or when that is enclosed in its shell of wood, it doesn't actually continue to grow out. So then it becomes loose just because you actually have only one thing coming around, which is the stem of the tree, rather than having both things grow out and push against each other. So depending on what the size of the branch is and the species, it takes between 1 and 10 years for a normal sized pruning wound to be covered over by the tree. And again, we'll talk about this in a second, but when we say a tree seals over a wound, we're very specifically saying that it seals, because trees do not heal in the same sense that a person would, where if you cut a person, you actually grow new skin where that old skin was damaged. Whereas trees will not do that. Trees will always take whatever living tissues they have and then slowly over time seal over their wounds. That way nothing can get in it, whether that be an insect or a fungus or other kinds of pathogens. So there's the difference. And so what we're trying to do with pruning for forest trees is we're trying to reduce the amount of encased knots. We're trying to reduce the amount of ingrown knots, but if we have to have one, we'd rather have the tight one. But as soon as you trim that tree and you cut it short, or you cut the limbs off, what you're doing is you're starting that process early of having that tree start to close over and put on new fresh wood. So when we're looking at pruning forest trees, we have to, again, look at timing to make sure that we're cutting small enough branches. We also want to make sure that we're not cutting too much of the living canopy of the tree. So again, when we're looking at our objective for high value timber, which is a clear butt log with no or very few knots, we need to consider your stand density and your rotation interval. So the main reason for that is if you have, as you plant trees in when they're very young, you plant them fairly close together with a high density. And the reason for that is that whenever you have trees that you want to get tall and long, to have a good amount of wood that comes out of them, you're going to want to have trees next to them to end up forcing those trees to grow upwards. Whereas if you have a tree that's just growing out in the open in the middle of a park or something, it has no real reason to grow super tall. So it's going to end up growing out wide. So it gets a lot of big branches. So if you have your stand density and a long rotation interval, you know you're going to have those trees there for a long time. That's going to be more beneficial than, or for pruning, than if you have a very low density and a very short rotation, or either just a short rotation. And the reason for that is that if you have a short rotation, then the tree's not going to have enough time to put on enough wood to actually make that a nice log. So in that situation, you may not actually have enough time, quite literally, for the trees to develop this nice wood. You also want to focus on species and shade tolerance. Sometimes a different species will put on new growth. They'll sprout out from where your cuts were if they aren't getting enough light, if they are very shade tolerant species. And also you have to consider your future management. And this is because if you are coming in to prune a tree at say year 0, and then then after that, you're going to go out and prune, or I'm sorry, you're going to go thin, then you're going to end up getting cause maybe some issues where you are spending some money to prune the trees, and then afterwards you're coming back in and then removing a bunch of trees in your thinning operation that you actually just came in to prune. So you usually want to do that in the opposite, but we'll talk about that in a second. But finally, I want to make sure that we're touching on cost, because anytime you enter a stand, that is a cost. So whenever you are adding a new cost, as you're managing these timber units over several decades, each time you come in, you are putting that cost in a bank and you're just holding on to it. So you of course want to make sure to reduce your costs and make sure that if you do go into a timber stand, that once you enter, that cost will then be accounted for later down the line with whatever your profit is going to be in terms of selling a high value log. So again, we want to look at species and the amount of pruning that you need to do. So this picture on the left is a great example because it shows 2 suitable trees on either side, and then in the middle you see some trees that maybe aren't the best for pruning. So the reason for that, the reason you want to look at this kind of thing is because if you're doing a thinning operation, you'd probably want to get rid of the trees that are less valuable. So instead of pruning all 4 of these trees, you would only really want to prune the 2 on the left and the right, and then the 2 in the middle, maybe those would come out during a thinning operation, or maybe you just see if they could be used for some other product of some kind. But you want to really focus on your dominant trees. They have to be straight, vigorous. You want them to be co-dominant at best. That way they can still force each other to go upright. And you want to make sure that you're choosing species that are going to have these high value stems. So of course you don't want to prune a tree that you're just going to turn into pulp. That doesn't really, that doesn't add up at the end of the day. So again, as I've said a couple of times, ensure that they're not on the chopping block for a thinning operation in the next couple of years. So this is an example where we then, from that last picture, we removed those 2 middle trees, and now we have just the on the outside. So in this instance, these trees might be a little bit too far spaced because light may be able to come in diagonally. And anytime you're going to be pruning a tree, if you prune it too high, you can stress the tree out. Once you stress a tree out, it starts triggering different responses inside the tree. Those responses could mean that the tree says, I'm dying, I need to get more energy. So it may sprout out new sprouts from the blank stem that you've cut. So in here would be on the left side. I'm sure many of you have seen people who have pruned their trees, either landscape trees or trees in the forest, maybe next to a power line. And they prune the tree really high on one side. Now, if that's the south side of a tree where sun's going to be hitting very constantly, that tree's going to react by putting out new sprouts, and that kind of circumvents your entire reason for doing that pruning in the first place. So you don't want to have your trees spaced too far apart, because then they could react with a new addition of light after your thinning. But if these trees were just a little bit closer together, this is obviously just for our example here, then those would be really good candidates because they would still be almost at crown closure. So no light would begin underneath on those blank stems, and then the trees will continue to grow up. So what we're looking for is to prune down to, or prune trees, and you want to start at about 4 inches or so would be a proper time. I remember we were trying to do this at tree school at Clackamas Community College a few years ago now, and we couldn't find any small enough trees to say these are really good candidates. But a good rule of thumb would be about 4 inches to start with. That way, you have a 4-inch middle, and then everything after that is going to be the core. And so what you want to focus on is your core size. So if you start at 4 inches and you want to make sure that you're getting another, let's say 20 inches of core size, and that's going to be the diameter outside the stub. So you end up getting yourself 20 inches or 16 inches worth of wood after that initial 4, if you're cutting your trees when they're at 20 inches. And again, look at your stand development phase. That's when we're talking about if you're at crown closure, or if you still have very wide open space trees where a lot of light can get in down to that area. And you also want to look at your current age. So if you're, we're always looking again on the tree's timeline. So if you are going to come into your stand, prune it, and then 10 years later, you're going to harvest that whole stand, you're going to end up finding yourself wasting money on that pruning because you didn't give enough time for that tree to put on that big core and actually get you that valuable lumber. So a couple different things to look at. Again, I just want to reiterate is that you're looking at the stand development, you're looking at your future management, and you're looking at your time till you're harvesting, your rotation time when you're going to harvest those trees. And you want to make sure that those are all lining up correctly, because if you do get that to work out really well, then at the end of your rotation, many of your trees, or all of them, depending on which ones you choose to thin or to prune, you'll have extremely large, really nice, high value trees that can really add quite a bit to your bottom line. So timing, stand development phase is important for you to, or is a big factor to consider. So you don't want to prune trees too early for the same reason I was discussing earlier, where if you have small trees that are at a wide spacing, light can get in and cause those trees to sprout. Next, you would like to make sure that your trees are not too big, because if they're too big, then you're not going to get a whole lot of reaction out of those pruning, and you wouldn't necessarily be able to get your saw up high enough. So you want to make sure to do it incrementally at the right phase. So a really good way to coordinate this would be at year X, do your thinning. At year X plus 1, come in and do your pruning. That way you can thin the trees out and then make them, or put them at the density that you prefer. Give them 1 year's worth of growth to react to that new condition, and then prune them up. So then ideally they'll have gone just a little bit closer to canopy closure after the thinning, and then you won't have too much light coming in. You'll be able to prune off all those lower limbs without having to concern yourself too much with having different light affecting the new cut areas. You also want to consider the time of year that you're doing this. We were joking about this before we started here, and we had noted the best time to prune is later in fall or winter. And Mike was saying the best time to do it is if it's raining. That's a good time to prune. And it's very true. And the reason for that is twofold. One, when in our area up in the temperate Pacific Northwest, later in fall and in winter, the trees are dormant, most of them. So as our trees are dormant, they aren't pushing out sap very often, only basically holding things there for protection in case something goes wrong during the wintertime. They're not actively doing a huge amount of photosynthesis or any, real gigantic physiological things. They're kind of just humming along until they can find their, until springtime comes. So when you prune during that time, pardon me. When you prune during fall and winter, the tree then reacts to it very quickly the next year rather than pruning at it during the time when it's really physiologically active, because then that can cause quite a bit of stress for the tree. Secondly, you want to make sure that you are trying to prune when insects and diseases are at their most or their least activity, their lowest amount of activity rather. So a big important insect we have around here is Sequoia pitch moth. And a lot of times that'll get into different pine trees, Douglas fir. And there's also another torbid beetle, there's another beetle, or I'm sorry, moth, that finds its way into shore pine very, very frequently. And if you walk around to anywhere in a landscape and you can see a pine tree with these giant amount of sap coming out, or these big globules of sap. And usually that's because of this moth. And what happened is someone pruned that tree. All of the chemicals started to oxidize, go into the air, volatilize rather. And then all of a sudden this insect is like, oh, there's a tree that was pruned, and they'll bore in and they'll cause damage to the tree, which reduces its growth. They also cause damage to the wood because they're boring into it, and that can reduce your value. So if you do it later in the fall or in the winter, you reduce the amount of insects and diseases that could get into the pruning wound, and you can reduce the amount of stress that you put on the tree. So an important thing to note again is that if you can work your objectives of pruning in with the physiological ideals that the tree is trying to pursue, then you'll find yourself working with the tree rather than working against it. So anytime you can take the opportunity to help yourself and help the tree, then in the long run, you end up getting yourself a much higher value for whatever cost it was that you spent to get in there. So here's a nice little drawing of some pruning that's done, and this is a 3-lift operation. So as you can see here, what you do when the trees are small, and this doesn't necessarily show anything about thinning, to be clear. So you can see where basically what you want to make sure that you never do is prune more than 50% of the live crown, because if you start stressing the tree by pruning off too much, then you end up finding yourself working again against the tree rather than working with the tree. So in the from the left to right here, the first time you come in, you thin, then you come in and you prune your trees at when they're about 16 feet tall, and you prune them up to 8 feet to keep that 8 foot or that 50% live crown. And then several years later, when you have a 24-foot tall tree, now you're pruning up to 12 feet. And then on the far left side, I believe that's 16 feet, but this is in a way, there we go, 37 feet with 18.5 feet. So once you get up to that level, again, you're thinking of making sure that you are pruning for your objective. Your objective would be lumber that is clear and has really nice wood with 0 knots. So the more you prune, as the tree grows taller, it's going to slowly, it's basically like a big cone. So when you prune below, it's going to put on more wood quicker. So each year, that very bottom part where you cut the very first year, that's going to be putting on more and more and more wood. So after that 3rd time lift, you want that tree to be able to grow for another 20 years or so, or at least put on several more inches so that you can get that top portion to catch up with the size of the bottom. So again, just to make sure that that was a little bit, or that's not too confusing. Again, from the bottom, you prune off on the very first time, you prune off the lowest branch. Starting at that time, that very first lift, you're going to start getting more and more clear wood on the very bottom of the tree. Whereas at the 3rd lift, with the topmost branch that you prune off, that one now at the 3rd time will just now begin to start putting on its new clear wood. So you have to give it enough time after your last lift in order for the whole 18.5 feet to have one section of clear logs. Then after that, the whole rest of it's just going to be getting better and better. So again, we want to focus on cost versus benefit. Like I said before, trees will take care of themselves. They'll just do it on their timeline, which could be many hundreds of years for our trees out here in the Pacific Northwest. But in order to basically speed that process along, and create a more higher value tree or more higher value lumber, you want to focus on the cost versus benefit over a certain period of time. So any pruning operation was going to make a bet about future markets. Again, as we cut that last log up to 18.5 feet, then we wait for several years, maybe decades, before we actually harvest that wood. We're assuming that after this 50 or 80-year rotation, that at year 1, we put together this nice plan. At year 80, that plan has actually paid off. So you want to make sure that you are paying attention to markets, seeing where things are going to go, and hoping that you're going to have some very high quality wood. And secondary, you want to remember that anytime you enter a stand, that's cost for money. It's cost for labor, it's cost for tools, it's cost for maintenance of vehicles or getting someone out there. Anything that is that ends up going into that is not going to come back out in your wallet until you sell that lumber way down the line. So remember to take those into consideration. And this always will come based on your own understanding of your economic situation. You know, if you have a whole bunch of trees and you're like, well, I'm going to try this over, put a little bit more money into a couple acres over here, but I'm going to keep the rest of these acres over here because I know these will sell and I know how this is going to grow, less risky. So if you have the opportunity to kind of play around and, diversify your forest portfolio, if you will, that could be a really good method rather than going full bore one way or full bore the other. It's just a lot of things that really change depending on the size of your ownership, what you're growing them for, if you're just casually growing trees because you like to do it, or if this is your children's college fund or something like that. Taking the risks and the considerations of future markets as well as the costs is really something to consider.
A little anecdote last year that a small woodland owner brought up to me and looking at cost benefit was that it can change if you have teenagers, where they let me know that sending their teenagers out to their trees to prune them is a benefit and will actually save them money by keeping them out of trouble. So I thought that was a fun little reverse of the cost benefit analysis.
There you go. So that's a good plan. If you have free labor, you might as well use it. All right. So Dan, did you want to touch on this, or do we want to start for questions, or keep going at this point?
We'll do a couple more slides, Casey, with you, and then we can stop for some questions. But
excellent.
Right now, as we talk about tree biology, physiology, and growth, they really relate to both the timber side and the landscape side, because it's trees.
That's exactly right. Well, thanks for reminding me that is the case, because I think it's important for everyone to understand whether you are pruning a tree for hazelnuts, or if you're pruning for fruit of any other kind, stone fruits, if you're pruning for landscape, if you're pruning for these timber trees. All trees, at least the ones that are going to be growing around the Pacific Northwest here, they all grow the same exact way. And this is the basic foundation, the basic framework that trees are growing on. So on the very far outside is the outer bark. And then as you move in from the tree, you have the vascular cambium, which is the vascular cambium or the xylem. We also have the phloem here. So starting from the outer bark, which is dead tissue that acts as a protective layer, as you move in, you have the phloem. And the phloem is responsible for taking photosynthate down from the higher areas of the tree. So whatever the leaves create, all that energy, all that energy and sugar, those are all being dispersed through the tree via the phloem, which takes mostly things down. You can imagine the phloem as the tissues that flow downwards. And then you have the vascular cambium or the xylem. And what that is areas, or it's the part that mostly grows inwards towards the middle of the tree. And xylem, the way you can remember that is it's Greek for wood. So that is what actually becomes the physical thing that we call wood. Initially, it's many tissues that then sort of harden up and lignify. Once those tissues harden up and lignify, they create this nice layer. I like to think about it as a actually, I just thought of this last week, and so I shouldn't say I like to think about it. But if you ever have go to Dairy Queen and you get a cone and they dip it into chocolate and they pull it out. At the very beginning, that chocolate is really gooey and it doesn't really have a whole lot of strength to it. But then you just let it sit there for a little bit, and then it really hardens up and becomes this really dense shell on the outside of that cone. Same exact thing happens here with the xylem, where every year during spring, it puts on this really flimsy layer that grows out, and then it really hardens and strengthens everywhere that it needs to strengthen. So as the tree ages, it puts on new rings, and the vascular cambium and the phloem slowly move out, because that's always going to be between the sapwood on the inside and between the bark on the outside. That little layer underneath the bark outside of the wood is the vascular system of the tree. It takes things in, or it takes things in from the bark, and it takes things from the sapwood and brings it out, and it takes water and nutrients up, and it takes photosynthate down from the rest of the tree. So whenever you injure that section of the, or any of the vascular cambium under the tree, whether it's from pruning or a car bashes into it or something, you end up getting a wound on the tree. And that wound, excuse me, as I noted, will always get sealed over. So if you have a wound like this, the tree will never just grow a new section of vascular cambium or bark underneath. It will always have to come in from the sides. So we'll show you some examples of trees doing what we call compartmentalization, which is where they're compartmentalizing over that wound so that they can still grow healthily afterwards. So on the left here, you can see the biology basics, and I highly recommend that you take a couple notes of what those are and how they work, because they really affect what you're going to be doing as a timber owner, to make sure that you are working, again, with the tree, not against it. So the sapwood, that is an area, it's all dead wood. It's not living cells, but they do transport water up into the tree. And then in the very middle, there's the heartwood. And the heartwood is more or less inert, and it's called the heartwood because all it does is packed full of chemicals that the tree puts in there to make sure that it stays as decay resistant as possible. But otherwise, it creates this dense column, this interior support system for the tree. So every single year tree grows and puts on a new wood, it's supporting and reinforcing and covering up wounds, and basically reacting to whatever happened to it over the wintertime or in previous years that it still has to continue to go through. So when we're doing pruning, we're trying to avoid cutting these or nicking them as much as we can. And we're trying to make sure that we're keeping the sapwood and the heartwood as healthy as possible. That way we don't let in any decay, and we don't end up getting any other issues that come through from the tree. So when we're looking at the actual form of a branch, this is from Alex Shigo's, from Alex Shigo. I'm not sure 100% which one his book is, from which book or diagram, but this shows really exactly how a branch grows over time. So on the left side of your screen, where the branch itself is very small, that's going to be towards the innermost sections of the tree. And then on the right side, that is going to show the outside of the tree. You can see the bark on the very outside there. So as you're looking over there, there's going to be A and B on each one of these. The A is the trunk collar, and B is the branch collar. And these are two separate and distinct tissues inside the tree. They work together the way we were talking about earlier, where every single year B is going to grow and that branch is going to get a little bit thicker, and then A, or the trunk collar, is going to grow after that. So what happens, and this is why if you go to a park or you go to something, you see this massive red oak, or you see an old Douglas fir in an old growth forest that has this massive limb that looks like it's 40 feet long, and you're wondering, how can that ever stay up? It seems impossible to have that amount of weight held up at just one point. But that's because every single year, that branch grows outwards, then the trunk goes outwards to reinforce it. So you're getting a constant up and out step, more like building a sideways pyramid, where it just gets stronger and stronger and stronger as the years go by. And because each one of those are growing against each other and having a lot of pressure, and almost are creating, they can't quite pass things through them, the tissues are distinct, but they do end up finding themselves creating those knots that are really tight. So every single year, as A and B and A and B and A and B grow, those are reinforcing and tightening on each other as much as they can. So as soon as you stop that, and that tree starts to compartmentalize over a broken branch or something like that, that's when you get those loose knots. So this is the process that's living, creating those really tight knots. So moving on to the compartmentalization that we were talking about before. Compartmentalization of decay in trees, otherwise known as coated. That's another idea that was provided by Alex Shigo, where he, for the first time, with a few other folks, first started saying, how exactly do these trees work? What exactly is their mechanism of keeping keeping themselves healthy? So trees, again, do not heal, they seal. So this on the left side of this, you can see where there's a dead branch on that photo, and on the right side there's a branch that's still living. So what we're trying to do is work with the tree's defense response to create the most efficient response we possibly can. Or if you have that dead branch on the left side and you prune that branch off, then that tree is going to respond by covering over that wound much quicker. Whereas on the right side, that branch is still alive. You can see that there's what we call the branch collar and the branch bark ridge. If you can cut perfectly, then what you're going to do is not cut into the branch bark ridge, and you're not going to cut into the branch collar, because those are the physiologically separate locations in the tree, where you have the branch tissue and you have the branch collar and you'll have the trunk collar. Once those things are activated with the injury of the wood, whether that's because it's dead or because it's a living branch that was pruned off, you end up getting the tree to respond very quickly, very efficiently, and putting on their compartmentalization that ends up creating a space within the tree that is dead but covered up, and it creates a compartment that any fungus or other kinds of pathogens, if they get in there, which they surely will try, the tree will have already created a really nice little compartment that won't be able to let any of those decay organisms go further into the stem, up or down into the roots, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're really looking to do is we're focused on the physiological components within the branch collar, because that is the space that the tree is using to create the compartment that is 100% taken care of. So here's an example of two different kinds of cuts. One on the inside with that white arrow, that's a flush cut. And so the reason that that is not as good is because what you've done there is you've cut into the tree and you've cut off that branch collar, which means now the tree has to use other tissue that takes longer, that's not physiologically ready, that it's not the defense system, it's just sort of the area that has wood. So after this flush cut, you can see on the left side that tree is compartmentalizing because it's going to do it no matter what. But instead of having that nice circle over that branch close like this, you end up getting the whole stem of the tree has to slowly close like that. That takes a lot more energy, that takes a lot more effort, takes a lot more time, and it can create a lot more opportunity for decay to go into that area and up and down into the stem. Whereas if you look further out, that's a more proper cut where you can see that there's that nice perfect circle that's coming through. And that perfect circle on that one on the right ends up creating a situation where you have a much smaller space, and you can see on the top and bottom the tree is compartmentalized and kept any decay or any dead tissue from moving up into the stem or down further towards the base of the tree.
And this concept is something that is often misunderstood when people are looking to prune for that objective of creating clean wood, which it makes sense that if you didn't understand how the tree is dealing with these injuries, you would think, okay, I'm going to cut as close as I can to the tree so that they'll, reducing how far those stubs are going out, so it will build clean wood quicker. And this really shows that because of the way that trees deal with injury, you are actually creating more defect, and you're going to end up with less high quality timber by creating these bad cuts, to the point where you actually might have defects running up and down laterally from the wound that can have large consequences for not just the tree health, but the quality of the wood going forward to that point, from that point, excuse me.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And these two photos are a really good example of that, where you can see the one on the left has a lot more incipient decay and a lot more lines where the tree is compartmentalized up into the stem. Whereas on the right side, you can see where you still have really clear wood all the way through. So that's what we're trying to do. But our cuts would ideally be much smaller than those. So we'll take that into consideration. So branch terms, this is a quick show of what the terms are when I say flush cut versus a stub cut. So just as Dan said a second ago, a flush cut is a cut that's made too close to the main stem or branch that removes that branch collar tissue. And a stub cut is a cut that's made too far away and ends up leaving that little stub. If you really want which one's better kind of idea, always leave a stub rather than taking off that collar, because a stub, for all intents and purposes, would act the same as if a branch broke off that was already dead, or a branch broke off in a windstorm or something like that, and then that tree had to cover over that stub just a little bit. But again, what we're trying to do is make sure that when we're doing our cuts, we're trying to make sure that we are leaving the branch bark ridge and the branch collar perfectly intact and with a flat line, so that tree can react and cover over it as quickly as possible. That way we can get as much clear wood as possible. Whereas if you leave a stub, it takes longer. If you cut the branch collar, it takes longer and lets in more decay. All right, well, so it looks like now we should, would we like to take some questions?
Perfect. Oh, here I am. We got some.
All right.
But first of all, I just have to compliment you. And when I prune trees, the thought I always have is to be the tree. And so when I hear you say, Casey, that work with the tree rather than against it, I get this little image of Yoda, but it would kind of look like Dan, and it would be Dan Yoda, and it would say, work with the tree.
Work
So,
with the
perfect.
tree.
That's exactly what we
Couldn't agree
work
more.
with the tree, yeah. So, related to working with the tree, one of the questions is, are there different considerations for different species, such as ash, oak, and alder? And a similar one I've had is it different to prune conifers than it is to prune hardwoods in terms of the branch collar and all that kind of stuff?
There are some differences, yeah, and that would be less of a species thing specifically and more of a morphology, where a conifer, most of the ones at least that we have here, will be growing straight up, and the bark branch collar and that ridge will be almost indistinguishable because the bark is so thick it comes out and kind of covers it up. So if you just cut at the flat bark, as long as you're not cutting into where the branch kind of comes out, that's usually going to be a pretty good cut. Whereas if you have a broadleaf tree, then usually because of the form where they grow much more broadly, much more excurrent, you're going to find that the branch bark ridge and the branch collar are much more obvious or are not obvious, and you can't quite tell where they are. And that's what makes pruning landscape trees just a little bit more difficult, where you have to be able to find where is that ridge, and should the angle be, a little bit like this? Should it be like that? Should I cut it like this? Or most of the time with conifers, it's going to be just perfectly up and down, whereas it could be almost any kind of cut for the other species. But the other consideration is that most conifers are not going to put on a lot of sprouts most of the time. There are some exceptions, redwoods and some pines in the south for sure. The southeastern United States rather. But any other species, an ash, a cherry, for example, if you make almost any cut on them, many times if you make it just a little bit off and you nick it just the wrong way, then they're going to get sprouts all over the place. So that's another consideration where sometimes it's just, is this species or is this variety going to sprout a lot if I make a bad cut, or is it difficult to find the cut? And then finally, if I do make this cut, is it going to cause the tree to really just shoot out a bunch of branches in the wrong place, especially if you're letting more light down into that trunk? Douglas firs, ponderosa pine, they're really not going to sprout too often. Douglas firs will a little bit if they have a lot of light. Hemlocks definitely will. But if you are keeping the light fairly low, those shade intolerant species probably will not do a whole lot of sprouting.
And the other consideration again comes to objective. If you're thinking about pruning hardwoods for timber, thinking about the kind of wood you want for that, and realizing that different species have different forms they grow. If you look at a Doug fir out in a field, you still see the prominent one main stem with one growing outward. Many of our hardwood species that might be desirable for timber will, if left to their own devices, they put out multiple branches low to maximize their canopy area. So thinking about training the tree as they're young, if you're pruning something, for example, a black walnut, you might need to do more rotations of pruning to maintain and cut small branches to get a singular large stem, which would create the most high value timber once it's time to process the tree. The timing of them is also much different. We're typically high value timber and hardwoods. It's a longer rotation if you're looking for that furniture grade wood.
All right, excellent. So the next question has to do with back on the branch basic slide. On one side of the tree, there was a live branch, and on the other side, it was a dead branch. Is the pruning the same? Say, for example, on a Doug fir, would you prune the same if you're going for a dead branch versus a live branch? That's the picture.
Got perfect. There is a little bit of a distinction. So on the left side, you can see where there's that live tissue that the tree has started to put on over the top of that dead branch. Whenever you're doing pruning for that, do not cut off the reaction wood that's coming out onto that stem. So if there's already reaction wood there, leave that wood and then cut off only the dead tissue 100%. Whereas if there is a live branch, then that branch bark ridge is going to be moving down the stem and sort of going out as the tree gets a little bit wider. So you're going to be cutting just at the edge of that. So with Douglas fir, most of those branches, again, because the bark is so thick, when that branch stops growing, let's say that it is a lower limb that's been shaded out. So you just have a dead limb off of a Douglas fir. Then that tree is already starting to grow out and cover over the base of where it's already closed off the branch. So as that tree stem starts to grow out, it usually will make it so you can just cut it very cleanly outside the bark, and then the tree will be fine. Whereas if you do see that you start to see that, wow, it looks like that tree is pushing wood further out onto that dead limb, just cut at the end of that, of the living tissue. Whereas if it's a living branch, then just want to make sure that you're outside that branch collar.
I'll say
Got one more before we go ahead. Did you want to say something?
Real quick as well, and we'll go into a bit when we talk about the actual pruning techniques. But oftentimes with live branches, because of the green connective tissue that's there, you have to be much more careful when pruning, because you'll have a higher likelihood of the branch ripping or creating a wound that you're not looking for. Whereas the dead branch, it naturally has dried out, become more brittle, and the tree has worked to separate it from its live tissue. So it can be a little bit easier to prune at times.
Good. So one more, just a couple of slides before that, Casey, if you want to go back. This is a diagram. This is the one. Oh, yes. So you talked about the A and the B, and this person wanted to know what the C, D, and E, and G stood for.
Oh, gotcha. Well, I'd have to go back and look. If you ever read Shigo's book, I have a copy of his Modern Arboriculture right here, and it's full of diagrams, and so I wouldn't be able to tell you without 100% knowing, because he's got a lot of things on there. But right off the bat, I would say that the G on that, which is in a white letter, that's going to be the branch bark ridge. The F is probably some amount of bark, and then the E is probably the bark cambium. And then C and D, or D and C, I could not tell you 100% what he was pointing out there. I tried to look it up, but I don't think I have the book that this specific diagram is taken from.
Right.
But most likely he's talking about the cambium,
Right.
because he likes to really show every little bit of a tree very consistently. So in every photo, he'll have all those different parts, whether or not they're exactly necessarily what he's talking about at the time.
Perfect. Well, that's a good place to get back to where we were. And we'll leave these 3 questions to grow into more when we come back. So
Perfect.
Take it away.
All right. Well, Dan, this is all on you now.
Great. So shifting gears over to landscape trees. In this case you mentioned before, these can be quite diverse. It could be that small apple tree in your backyard. It could be a series of trees that are running down your driveway, or looking into urban trees as a whole, the street trees that make up our urban forest, creating benefits. And these trees deal with some different conditions than we see in the forest. And oftentimes that results in us having very specific objectives that we want when we're working with them, because we have such a close interaction with them. So some of the most common ones that you might think about when thinking about how to care for the trees in your own property through pruning could be thinking about ensuring the longevity or the health of the tree. You're reducing the stresses that it faces. You could be thinking about promoting a single leader to have grow into a form that you find desirable and that best suits the tree. And this also falls into young tree pruning, which we'll go into a bit later, which says, what can we do now while the tree is accessible and small to have it grow into the final product that we want? Also, you might be thinking about, how do I maintain the tree while getting some of the views that I want? Or how do I move it so I can have my trees close to my house without them touching and creating consequences of that? Also, I love being around trees, but I want to ensure that I'm safe, the tree is safe, and that there aren't any consequences that might be avoidable through care. You also might have a tree that has dealt with some serious damage through a windstorm, some bad pruning, or some other consequences that you want to bring back into a form and have to do some restoration pruning. You also might want to just focus on fruit production and prune your trees in ways that will maximize their product, be it apples, stone fruits, hazelnuts, anything you're looking for. And each one of these, you want to think about different aspects and concepts that we'll discuss. Sorry for that, I forgot to request control real quick. Great. Oop. The fun of learning new online systems for presenting. So I'm going to go through and talk about some of the types of pruning that you might want to think about or know more about for a tree in your landscapes. The first thing we're going to talk about is crown cleaning. And now this could be a small, medium, or large tree that you're really going in and focusing on pruning out aspects that might be creating a detriment to the tree. This could be removing dead branches that have the likelihood of falling out or not producing any more direct resources for the tree, as well as dying branches which may have broken off. Maybe they're in the process of being shaded out, so they're not creating photosynthetic benefits to the tree, as well as defective branches which may have broke, maybe have a fungus or disease that you want to remove so that they're not going to negatively affect the tree. Out of all of these, a shift that has been going on in the arboriculture community is to really focus more on dying and defective branches. These are the ones that, left untreated, can actually have a negative detriment on the health of the tree. As Casey brought up before, with dead branches, trees have the natural ability to compartmentalize and separate the material from those trees, from those branches to the rest of the tree. So dead wood on your tree, for the most part, is really not creating a negative characteristic for the tree. In most cases, there are some times that people are concerned that dead wood can bring in different vectors such as pathogens or insects, which might not be desirable, but it's a cost benefit there because dead wood also have great habitat benefit for allowing different species of animals to use that, to feed on it, as well as to use it for homes. So it's just something to think about as you're deciding what aspect of the tree you want to prune out. Out of all these, the defective branches that are broken are some of the ones that, if you see in your trees, are ones that should definitely be dealt with right away, because these are ones that, if they continue to rip or break, can create more wounds and create more defects in the rest of the tree. So thinning is a practice that is asked for and used quite a bit. Now, this one is also one that is done incorrectly all the time, and is something that can be a real struggle for arborists to see. because people like the idea of very clean trees, meaning very low branches sometimes. As we talked about beforehand, trees left to their own devices, just growing out in the woods or a field that haven't dealt with any pruning or any major failures, grow in a form which benefits them. They put out branches when they feel those branches are beneficial. They put out leaves when they feel those are beneficial, basically when those are bringing in energy to them. It's when we start messing with the hormones within the tree by pruning certain branches that sometimes trees can respond and put out new branches, which might be a detriment to the tree. So in thinning, what we're often looking for is areas of the tree that is putting out what we call epicormic branching, small sprouts which are been triggered by a change in the hormones of the tree, which are starting to grow in a manner which can have long-term consequences and take resources away from the parts of the tree that we want fully to have all the energy and water going towards. Oftentimes these can be into the interior of the tree where we want resources going out to the end branches to help promote growth and outward canopy. Again though, these small branches can also have a benefit of bringing sunlight and energy right into the heart of the tree itself. So oftentimes after thinning, if the tree has not been severely damaged, someone who has not been working in the process might not even be able to look at the tree and clearly say, okay, that tree has been pruned, that tree has been thinned. And that's kind of the objective that you want there. So it's really about the thought and care and the long-term growth that's going to happen. In urban settings, raising is a practice that is highly desirable. And there's two important ways to think about this. Raising can happen naturally with trees. If you have a small tree that's growing, and let's say it has a branch 3 feet off the ground, that tree is going to put on new growth and continue to grow upwards, but that branch is not going to grow up with it. It is going to stay at 3 feet through the duration of the tree's life. As we know about trees, as they put on higher branching, it's going to create shade that's eventually going to shade out the lower branches, which are going to fall off. That's why we call these temporary branching. They're on the tree to provide energy as the tree grows and younger, but ultimately the final form of the tree will not have those branches. As we're looking to create clearance, maybe on our street tree or an area where we need to walk or bring our lawnmower and clean our yard, we can help that process along. As long as there is enough upper canopy, we can prune off those temporary branches to help structure the tree to have clearance for where we want it. Sometimes we need to do this in urban settings because of the high frequency of people, cars walking underneath, where having those low branches, one, can be a kind of a pain for people walking, and two, knowing that people are going to encounter those, potentially break them off and create a defect, a hazard in the tree. So cost benefit analysis there of looking, is it better to prune these off now, take away the photosynthetic material at this point, or weigh it, is there a chance those branches may get broke and hurt the tree? And then we also have structural pruning. And this is one probably that as arborists, we do, probably the most common type of practice we do in medium and large trees. This is looking at those short-term benefits and the long-term growth of the trees. So it's looking at how the branches are growing currently and thinking about, as those grow, as the tree matures, what they're going to do and the consequences they might have. So this is where we would look for things like crossing branches, two branches that have grown and they're now rubbing against each other, and think, okay, in 20, 30 years, are these branches going to create a defect in the wood? They're going to create an injury or a form that's ultimately going to cause a failure. And if that's the case, that's why structural pruning works to prune them now. Same thing with looking at the direction or unions of branch unions, thinking about in the future, what is the best way we can promote a strong tree with branching and foliage in an area that's going to create the most benefits to the tree and the least likelihood for failure. Again, this is the type of pruning that people can get carried away from, thinking, if I just very much, we'll call it clean out the branches, what we call lion's tailing, which is removing all the small branching all the way up and just leaving hoofs of cotton candy leaves, or lion's tail, as I said, well, isn't that the best for the tree, because we've removed all those chances for defects there. But ultimately, do you see trees growing like that in nature? No, and there's a reason for that, because there's many issues that that can cause, both by taking away the energy and photosynthetic material in those branching, as well as from a physical standpoint of creating new branch unions, which have a higher likelihood of failure due to the exposure of the wind and the leverage that that can create. Structural pruning also highly relates to restoration pruning, where, again, a tree left to its own devices, for the most part, grows in a way that is beneficial, and that's because of the way that it is guided as a single source from hormones coming down from its tips, what's called its apical meristems, which go through the tree and basically direct where there should be branching, where there should be bud growth, and where there should be not, with this overall idea of, as an entity, what is benefiting that tree. When there's a large failure, let's say from a windstorm, in urban settings, oftentimes struck by a vehicle, or you've had someone prune some of the branches in a very aggressive manner, this can change the hormonal balance of the tree, where it is not communicating, we'll say, as overall form, and different parts of the tree are thinking there is a major area and they need to independently grow to put as much foliage on the tree as possible. When this happens, is you start to see branching that has a higher likelihood of failure, many single branches coming out from one branch union, branches growing in directions or in a pattern which can be less secure as more wood gets formed within the tree, or can just not be valuable for you for the purpose you have of the tree. So restoration pruning is something that can be a many-year process, but helps to prune away branching that brings the tree back to its true form, brings those hormonal balances back to a system that the tree would naturally have prior to the failure in the best way possible. If you look at the slide to the right here, you can see that this was most likely some poor pruning that happened, in that each one of those little sprouts that you see growing right below the union will eventually try to be a stem. That is not how this branch was naturally formed, with those two branches there. And so as those go in 20, 30 years, we'd have 10 2-inch branches there. Restoration pruning would be selecting the one or two that are the biggest or growing in the right direction, pruning the other ones away, and over time, helping those try to take the role that the previous branches once did. Just going to say again, Casey and I end up doing a lot of restoration pruning, and the entity which has created the most failures, or the biggest reason that we need to do this restoration pruning, has been poor pruning in the past, more so than natural storm events. So if we could leave you, as far as the landscape goes, with one bit of information on pruning and one type of pruning to focus on, young tree pruning is some of the best things that you can do for trees on your landscapes. Now, I mentioned that trees left to their own devices do a good job of putting on the form that we want. So you might be asking, well, if I'm planting a brand new tree in the ground, or I have a tree that's been there for 5 years and I haven't pruned it once, shouldn't it just be doing what trees do and growing the right form? And unfortunately, the answer is no, if that tree was not naturally seeded and grown there. Most of the trees that get planted in our urban landscapes come from our nursery and have been physically planted. Now, for many nurseries, it is the nature of how they grow trees to already start changing the physical structure of the trees to have them grow to that initial size as quickly as possible. So oftentimes when you're planting a brand new tree, it's already dealt with many stressful situations, which can lead to it growing in a manner that we won't desire, and if left untreated, can end up having a mature tree with many defects that can create a higher likelihood of failure or create you more hassle and work in the long run. So that's why pruning trees within the first 5 years can be one of the best things that you can do. Not only do you create small cuts, and if you think back on the timber pruning aspect of it, small cut early on in the tree gives the tree more time to compartmentalize over a smaller wound and put on new growth away from those branches. Small cuts also leave less room for potential pathogens to make its way into the tree, and it's much easier for the tree to seal over as it's young and growing vigorously.
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing, Dan.
Please.
There's a common idea of pruning young trees where 10%, or if you prune 10% of the tree when they're very young, you can avoid pruning, 10% pruning when it's young avoids 90% of the issues that you could find in the future. And one of the things that I think really helps is, again, going back to those nursery stock. A lot of times what they do is they grow a stem up, then they just top that stem, then they get a bunch of little sprouts that come out, then they choose which sprouts they want, and then they let the tree continue to build a new canopy. But what that does is create a lot of sprouts, all from one distinct spot on the tree stem. If you go out and look at almost any tree planted as a street tree, you'll see this pattern of a nice clear stem coming up and then a big bunch of new branches. It doesn't look very similar to what we have here in the bottom right of the screen. So if you plant a tree, let it get established, come back and make a couple cuts here and there to avoid, to space out the branches, avoid unions that you can see are very clearly going to be co-dominant in the future. You can avoid a huge amount of costs and damage decades later, where those little tiny stems that were this big in year 5 are now this big in year 10 or year 30, and then you can have one of those fail, or instead of you coming out there and snipping off one little branch, now you have to pay for someone who has a much larger saw who knows how to handle big trees over power lines or something like that. So 1 or 2, 10 small cuts on a young tree can really save you a lot of time and effort in the future.
Yeah, and that jumped right into that cost benefits comparison there, where it's not just the cost, as Casey mentioned, financially, where it is much easier to take care of young trees, and there are a lot of resources that you can take. Classes, if you are near the Portland area, Urban Forestry actually has a number of really great young tree pruning opportunities to get exposed with, and a lot of literature about how to do it. When it comes to taking care and pruning a larger tree, trees that are over 30, 40 feet, that's not something that we recommend homeowners taking care of, because there are a lot more complications and techniques involved with it. And so not only is that more costly, but if you do not take care of those trees, you put in all these resources to grow a tree to maturity, where you then have a higher likelihood of failure. You have more issues going on with the tree that could have been dealt with at a young age. Sorry, I don't know why that keeps exiting out on me. So this slide does a good job of kind of showing what that looks like, where oftentimes people think, okay, well, we'll deal with issues when we can see them and they're very apparent. Unfortunately, with how trees grow, not only is that much more difficult, but it can be an impossibility. So if you look at the good pruning versus bad pruning, you can see that some of the issues that were present at planting just continue to manifest and get worse as the tree grows and responds to them. Now, after 15 years of planting, if you look at that diagram, you say, okay, I want to make that tree look like the one that has been cared for since it was young. You can't do it. It is not a matter of just fixing the issues. Trees are growing living entities and respond year after year to past growth. So where we would have to do restoration pruning to try to slowly let the tree after 15 years work towards a natural form, which could take another 15 years, if even possible, to get it in a manner which would be anywhere close to the tree that has been cared for and grown in the manner that trees like to grow by reducing the different impacts that it's had. So in looking at some of the aspects of pruning young trees or pruning medium-sized trees that you can reach and deal with, what are some of the aspects you're trying to promote? Casey mentioned earlier that strong branch unions is extremely important to having a tree grow into maturity that is going to have branching that's going to be able to support all that canopy and wood that develops. What a strong branch union looks like is something that has a nice wide crotch angle, an area where, if you think back on that pruning diagram, a nice ridge and collar can develop year after year and expand and swell out to physically support the branch weight going in there. Something with a narrow collar, the angle of that union makes it much more difficult for the tree to put on the type of wood which creates that very nice reinforced strength on the tree compared to the wide angle. As well as looking at trees that have included bark, where the branch has been growing so tight that it actually isn't forming correctly, physiologically connecting to the tree in the manner that we want. As trees are young, you'll hear it over and over again in young tree pruning that developing one single stem is extremely important. And now this goes to the idea that I was talking about before with the tree's ability to send hormones out and guide the form that's going to best benefit the tree. Young trees want to grow up for the most part, reach the light, and then put out canopy. Different species will have different forms if they're always want to have that single straight leader through maturity, like a Doug fir, or a tree that might eventually put out multiple branches that support a canopy. You think something like an American elm. When they're young, both trees are going to grow in that same way to be able to grow up high, be able to put out those temporary branches until they reach a form and amount of wood on them where they can start to support their final true form. As Casey mentioned, oftentimes trees coming from the nursery can have been taught previously have multiple stems, which are now all competing to be that one strong dominant signal for the tree to grow. And the tree is now also splitting its resources into each one of those stems, which are not necessarily working together to produce the final resources the tree is going to need. You'll also look to say that you're going to have branches and trunk, and being able to maintain the distinction of this during a young tree is extremely important. As trees are young and they're developing their form, you don't want to get in a situation where you have a trunk come up and then split into multiple areas where you can't decipher which is the trunk and which is the branch, or the trunks and the branches are a very similar diameter. You always want the trunks to have a stronger, a wider diameter than the branches to be able to put more wood and resources to there to be able to grow up to their final form. Now, looking at branch unions, this is a great example of what I was talking about of included bark, where sometimes in the very tight branch unions, it might look like right where the two branches of the branch and stem come together, that it forms a tight crotch there in that the wood is sealed and connected all the way down, where in reality, situation can go, and it happens some, you'll see it more in some species rather than other, where instead of the branching growing out together, it is pushed against itself, and you actually have bark growing inside where those two unions are pressing. So rather than having all that connective tissue running down that seam, there's actually very little connective tissue, which makes the branch strength much less. So as weight develops on the end of that branch, you can just imagine the higher likelihood of failure when you have something that's just pressed against another form bending out rather than something that is interconnected all the way down. So this is the type of defect that if you see, it is great to prune out early, get rid of that defect now for when all that weight and those diameter in the branch expands and that failure is much greater.
All right. Hey, Dan, excuse me. I want to just stop you here for a minute. It's right on 11:30, and I know some folks are going to have to leave right away. So what I wanted to do was I will just do a quick posting of the poll and then announcing this afternoon's webinar, and then you can go ahead and continue on. But I know some people do have to leave at 11:30 because they've overbooked their schedule. So just I'm launching the final poll. It's just some wrap-up questions, what you thought of today's show, and to give us some feedback. And then I would just announce that this afternoon we have a webinar at 3 o'clock. John Souter, riparian management specialist from OSU Extension, is going to talk about riparian restoration for beginners. So join us again at 3 o'clock if you're available. Hang with us as long as you can. We're going to go until 11:45, but I know some people have to go. So thanks a lot. Back to you, Dan. Thanks for the break.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I apologize for running over when Casey and I get going on trees. Sometimes the time slips away. So I'll run through a couple things a little bit quicker, and I really want to highlight a couple of the actual pruning techniques, which is really important to know. So I'll jump through this slide real quick just to note that there are often two different kinds of removals. One, when you're removing the branch. The other time when you might have a situation where you actually need to remove a larger branch or the stem and leave a branch. There is a good rule of thumb here where you can, it is much more ideal for the tree to remove the branch or the smaller portion. But if a situation comes up where you need to do a reduction cut, you want to ensure that the branch that you're leaving behind is at least 1/3 or greater the diameter of the branch that's removing, so that it has the ability to take over and grow as the new branch and be able to dominate. Otherwise, you'll end up in a situation where you'll have many sprouts coming out, and it can be detrimental to the final product that you're looking for. As well as something to consider while pruning is the idea of a pruning budget. Every time you're taking off live tissue from the tree, taking off area where you're going to have leaves, that you're reducing the energy that's coming into the tree. And so even though there could be times that what you're removing in the long term is beneficial for the tree, removing it all at once can be detrimental. You're taking away too much canopy. So a good rule of thumb is to think about not removing more than 25% at most of the canopy of the tree that you're pruning. And ideally, especially as the tree is small, the least amount of canopy you need to remove, the better, especially if it's your own tree and you can come back every couple years. It's always better to space it out and take off a little bit rather than doing it all at once. If you have a big pruning project, a big restoration, sometimes it can take years to be able to prune the tree to bring it back to where you wanted it. So I want to talk a second about the 3-cut method. Now this is extremely important to know, and it relates to how to actually cut the branches. This technique is used to prevent situations where while cutting the branch, it ends up tearing beyond the branch collar into the stem of the tree and creating long-term issues. So what can get confusing with people for this is the why you're doing it. And the primary reason is to deal and manage the end weight on the branches. And if we have time, we have a demonstration of this. But what you want to do is start by going 2 to 3 inches away from the branch collar, beginning cut 1, and just cut a quarter of the way into the branch. Cut through that live tissue there, follow up by going out an inch on the top of the branch and cutting straight through. This is going to leave you a little stub. Now this stub has no weight on it, so you can go back and make that final cut at the branch collar without fear that as you were making the cut, the weight of the branch would pull it and rip it down the stem. These are some examples of what that tear out looks like and what we're trying to avoid. As you can see, these weren't, a 3-cut wasn't used, so that as they were making that cut from the top of the branch, the weight of the branch pulled it down and actually broke and ripped the fibers before they were able to cut it with their saw. And because of the way that the cambium and the xylem work, the connectivity of those tissues ripped all the way down beyond the collar, and in some cases far down the stem. Now we know that the cambium and the xylem, the phloem are extremely important for providing resources and water to the tree, but that trees will also now have to compartmentalize on that trunk and deal with those injuries for the rest of their life. So ensuring that you're making good cuts, it also really has to do with using the right tools. If you're an experienced homeowner, getting the right tools can be extremely important. Some of the best pruning you can do on a small tree is with hand pruners alone, because the small cuts are really beneficial, and it means that you're pruning it at an age where it is not growing over your head yet, and you don't need to make large cuts. When working out in the woods, if you're doing either timber pruning or landscape pruning, working with a pole pruner or a pole saw that's extremely sharp and allows you to make those good cuts while you have control can be extremely important. Some people also very much enjoy using loppers, which are big hand pruners you don't know. I personally do not like them because I don't think you can get as much control, but it's a controversial topic in the arborist world. As we're running out of time, do you want to specify one of the biggest mistakes that people make in their landscape trees is the idea of topping them, saying my tree is too tall, or if I cut all the branches to stub them off, then I can control the growth, I can maintain it. It reduces some of the hazard because I won't have long branches growing where I don't want them. And in the truth, it has extreme detriments to the tree and can create very unsafe and unproductive situations. Topping trees, now that you know about how tree physiology works, trees cannot really compartmentalize successfully on all those wounds. And you've also taken off all the hormones, the branching on the trees, which dictate how the tree is going to grow. So from every one of those wounds, you will now have multiple shoots coming up competing that are growing with unions that are not that well attached to the tree itself. So as they get larger, you might have the canopy grow back 10, 20 feet beyond this, but it is not nearly as strong as it once was, and has many more defects, likely has many more defects in the union. And this is something that we often see with the young trees too. So they were really off target with their pruning attempt here, where they're thinking, oh, I'm gonna prune these young trees, I'll top them now, keep them small, and create more benefit for the long run. They've just set themselves up for a lifetime of maintenance stress and cut the longevity and the amount of work that's gonna be required on these trees, probably to increase it tenfold by topping them at this point. So that's running through what we have for landscape pruning. Hopefully we have some time for questions, Mike.
Yep. We got a few minutes. I don't think we're going to get to your video, but we've got 5 outstanding questions that I think are definitely worth talking about. Can you leave it on and just put the last slide up? Perfect. So this is one of my favorite kind of questions, is the brother-in-law question. My brother-in-law pruned a cherry tree to have a single leader. It grew very tall, and now we cannot reach the fruit on the single trunk. Anything we can do to create multiple trunks or branches that yield the fruit at a lower level?
Yeah, so this speaks directly to the idea of purpose. What is your objective with that tree? And it sounds in this case, it was to be able to have cherries, you know, which is common for many fruit trees. The accessibility of the fruit is very important. So in typical fruit tree pruning or orchard pruning, they do try to keep the trees low by not supporting a strong single stem that keeps those fruit low. At this point, what you can do is using that rule of 1/3 and the 25% canopy. If you can reach the top of the tree or hire someone to reach the top of the tree, you can begin the process of reducing the top while still supporting the tree's health. Again, this is not something I support to do for your every landscape tree, but if your specific objective for this tree is to be able to reach your cherries, you can start the process of reducing the tree by taking some of the lower branches and training them to basically be the new top of the tree.
Correct. And one last thing to add to that is that fruit tree pruning is very, or at least for the fruit production, is pretty substantially different than taking care of a tree either for timber quality or for landscape health. And the reason for that is that when you are creating a tree that produces a lot of fruit, the reason that it's producing so much fruit in a lot of instances is because the tree is stressed. So they constantly bring the tree down and add stressors to it in either from the soil or from actually pruning on the tree. And then that stress response from the tree is, oh, I need to make some fruit. I need to create but new trees. So a lot of times it's a little bit different, and you have to be very specific in your objective, because a lot of them they don't necessarily, you can't prune a fruit tree to look nice and produce a lot of fruit necessarily. It can be done, but it certainly if you look at orchards, their trees are heavily managed.
Not always pretty, but boy, they produce the cherries. So I hope
Correct,
that
that's
answered
for
it.
sure.
Great answers. I'd also say something about the brother-in-law, but we won't go that. So this is interesting when related to fruit trees again. How can I tell if a branch is dead or if the deers have just eaten all the leaves off?
So, this is something that we encounter a lot, where some of the best time to prune landscape trees is in the winter, where you're not pruning off the branches that just recently leafed out and haven't been able to pull all that energy and resources for that. But it can be very hard to say, is this a branch that has no leaves on it, or is it a dead branch? A technique which is helpful for me, especially on younger branches, if you take your fingernail, and it's a thin bark tree or a pruning tool, and you just lightly scrape the bark, creating a very small wound, you can tell right away if there is a little bit of green cambial tissue in there, which will be apparent even in the winter, or if the deer has eaten off the leaves, or if it's just straight brown and dead. The other way is giving the tree a little shake. The elasticity of live branches has completely different motion and is almost more like a whip, flexing around, where dead branches stay very rigid and basically only shift from the union that are connected to the tree.
Excellent. I knew the green thing, but that shaking thing, that's a new one. Good answer. So how can we prevent sun scald after pruning?
This is actually an interesting one. Water your trees. That would be the best answer I could give. The other answer would be trying to make sure that sun doesn't hit it directly. But sun scald, recent research has gone into it, and I have a document by a researcher out of Wisconsin, and he studied what exactly is causing sun scald. And most people would think that it is sun hitting a blank stem from the southwestern side, because we always see it on that southwestern side. It turns out that's true, but it actually is more related to having a lack of water, so that tree cannot fully put water into those cells to keep them well hydrated, and then they end up getting dried out on that side of the tree. So it turns out that you can still plant a tree that has sun hitting it on bare bark, because that happens in nature all the time. But if you can make sure that your tree is well watered, has a lot of mulch at the base of it, and is really putting or in the healthiest condition that it can be, you'll reduce sun scald. The other thing would be trying to let the bark get a little bit thicker before you prune off the limbs on one side, especially the southwestern side. That way you can at least keep it shaded. So you can kind of hit it from two different sides there. But ultimately the health of the tree is what will make the tree healthy, I guess would be a fine way to put it.
All right. This is a somewhat related one. To reduce the chance of blowdown, is it advisable to thin the crown of large trees to reduce the wind sail effect?
Do you want to go ahead, Casey?
Okay, sounds good. It is, in fact, not. And this is something that I ran into while I was a consultant up in Seattle, because a lot of people have big Douglas fir and hemlock growing up in Seattle that has a lot of hills. So there's a lot of these big hilltop trees. And they were really worried about that exact problem. And Dan and I had a consultation not a couple of weeks ago about the same thing. So the wind sail effect, for those of you who may not be familiar, the common thought was that you have this big tree and it acts as a sail in the same way that a sail on a boat would, where it captures the wind and then the wind pushes it, then has to escape. That's not exactly how it is. It turns out that the tree itself with a full canopy, and this could be a 100-foot tall Douglas fir, open grown, or it could be a red oak, it could be any tree. That tree, as it's growing, has a full canopy that moves and sways in a rotating fashion. So as soon as wind hits it, the tree kind of twists and deflects off that wind and then comes back and then twists and deflects off that wind. All the branches slowly move out and bend and then come back. So as the tree is doing that, every time it bends and comes back, the tree is registering that as oh, I'm wounded, there's a strain, there's a pull, there's a tear, and then the next year it reinforces wherever that wound or that stressor, that stress was. So every time the wind hits a tree, it makes it stronger. But next, what people have thought is they say, well, if I have a tree that's like this and wind cannot go through it, if I thin it out and let wind pass through the canopy, then what that does is allow wind to go through the canopy and then the tree stays nice and tall, not a wind sail. That, in fact, is misguided, because what that does is that increases the amount of air that's going through the canopy of that tree, which instead of having drag that comes on the bottom, around the outside, and around the top, now you have wind causing drag on each individual branch rather than the whole canopy as one big unit. So when you do that, you actually end up increasing the likelihood that the individual branches are going to fall off and going to fall on your house, which is what you were trying to avoid in the beginning. And it's also going to cause some issues with the tree is going to be less happy because you're removing a bunch of healthy limbs that aren't doing, that were doing quite a good job. So thinning to reduce a wind sail is an old theory that science is showing more and more is not actually accomplishing the objectives that people are looking for, and they end up causing more damage than good by allowing too much wind to go through the tree rather than letting that whole tree as a unit move and then react and then move and then react over time.
Excellent. Just a great demonstration of becoming the tree there, Casey. You just look like a tree.
You should
Great answer.
See, yeah, that's great.
Great webinar, guys. I really appreciate it. We're going to have to cut it off here, but I did want you to not show the video now and talk about it, but I'm wondering if you could send it to Amanda and she could post it on the resources page so people could at least see it. They wouldn't have your narration, but that would be something.
Yeah, we can do.
So thank you all very.
We'll add a couple quick notes to the slide with a little narration so people can get a chance to see in practice some of the principles that we were talking about today.
Excellent. Very good. Really good webinar. Thank you all for being here, and join us this afternoon for Dr. Souter. Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Amanda.